In the spring of 1867, somewhere deep in the backwoods of rural Georgia, a man named Samuel was being led to his death. He was 6 feet 8 inches tall with hands the size of dinner plates and a back that carried scars like a road map of suffering. Each line told a story of 23 years spent in chains. 23 years of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, of sun that burned the skin and cold that crept into the bones during winter months when slave quarters offered little protection from the elements. Samuel had been born into slavery in 1844. 3 years before, his mother died during childbirth with his younger sister, who lived only 2 days before joining her mother in whatever lay beyond this world of suffering. He never knew his father, though he'd heard whispers that the man had been sold south to Mississippi when Samuel was still an infant. What Samuel did know intimately was the rhythm of plantation life, the crack of leather against skin, the hollow feeling of hunger that never quite left, even after meals of cornmeal and fatback, and the careful mask every enslaved person learned to wear to survive another day in a world that considered them property rather than people. But Samuel had committed an unforgivable sin in the eyes of his owners. A transgression that in the twisted logic of the antebellum South and its immediate aftermath was considered more dangerous than theft, more threatening than running away, more intolerable than even striking an overseer in self-defense. He had dared to look a white overseer directly in the eye. Not with hatred burning in his gaze, not with defiance or challenge, or any of the things that white men constantly feared from the people they held in bondage, just with the quiet dignity of a human being who had forgotten for one dangerous moment that he was supposed to pretend he wasn't one. That single glance, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 seconds on a hot afternoon while Samuel was hauling water buckets from the well to the fields, cost him everything he had, which admittedly wasn't much, but in that moment represented the difference between life and death. The overseer, a man named Garrett Cole, had felt something crack inside his chest when Samuel's gaze met his own. It wasn't fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of the cocktail of emotions that surged through him in that moment. It was something worse, something that gnawed at the foundations of his entire worldview: recognition. The uncomfortable, undeniable awareness that the massive man standing before him in torn clothing and bare feet, his skin glistening with sweat from hours of labor under the merciless Georgia sun, possessed something Garrett himself lacked, and had always lacked, and would always lack, no matter how many men he commanded, or how many whips he cracked, or how many times he told himself he was superior by virtue of the color of his skin. A kind of unbroken core that no whip could reach, no chain could bind, no degradation could destroy. Samuel's eyes held a soul that remained somehow intact despite everything the institution of slavery had done to crush it. And in seeing that soul, Garrett was forced to confront the emptiness of his own. Garrett had built his entire sense of self on a foundation of superiority that now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. His father had owned slaves. His grandfather had owned slaves. And the natural order of things as he understood it placed him above men like Samuel by divine right and natural law and the simple fact of birth. The preachers said it was biblical. The politicians said it was constitutional. The scientists with their calipers and charts said it was biological. Garrett had never questioned any of it because questioning would have required him to examine his own life too closely, to wonder what he had actually accomplished beyond being born white in a world that rewarded whiteness above all else. But in that moment of eye contact, lasting only seconds but feeling like an eternity, the whole structure wobbled. The lie became visible, and Garrett, like so many frightened men throughout history confronted with truths they cannot bear to acknowledge, did the only thing his limited imagination allowed: he destroyed the thing that made him feel small. The punishment was decided quickly with none of the pretense of justice that had sometimes, though rarely, characterized slave discipline in earlier times. No trial, no hearing, no gathering of other slaves to witness the consequences of transgression as a lesson to them all. Just a conversation between Garrett and the plantation owner, Thomas Rutherford, conducted over glasses of whiskey in a study lined with books neither man had actually read, but both kept for the appearance of education and refinement. Rutherford was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The war had ended 2 years ago, but its effects rippled through the South like aftershocks from an earthquake that had shattered the old world without quite building a new one to replace it. He had 87 former slaves still working his land under new contracts that weren't really that different from the old arrangements, except now he had to pretend to pay them, and the pretense was expensive in ways both financial and psychological. The cotton market was unpredictable. Northern carpetbaggers were sniffing around looking for land to buy cheap. His own sons had died at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, their graves marked by wooden crosses somewhere in Pennsylvania and Tennessee. Everything he had known was dying, and he didn't have the energy to birth something new. Samuel was strong, remarkably so, the kind of worker who could do the labor of two men without complaint. Valuable, in other words, or at least he would have been valuable in the old days when such things were calculated in simple economic terms. Under normal circumstances, Rutherford would have balked at the idea of killing productive property, would have argued for a whipping or a sale to a plantation further south, or some other punishment that preserved the value of his investment. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Samuel wasn't technically property anymore, though the distinction between legal freedom and practical freedom was vast enough to swallow entire lives. Garrett had been insistent, and Rutherford had learned over the years that sometimes it was easier to give men like Garrett what they wanted than to deal with the sullen resentment that followed refusal. The world was changing in ways neither of them fully understood, and in the face of that change, small acts of cruelty felt like attempts to hold on to something familiar, even if that familiar thing was monstrous. "He's getting ideas," Garrett had said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass and watching the lamplight play through it. "Looking at me like he's my equal. Like the war changed something fundamental. You let that spread. You let that attitude take root. And before you know it, they're all doing it. They're all forgetting their place. Then where are we? What's to stop them from just walking off? From demanding real wages, from acting like they own themselves?" The questions hung in the air between them, unanswered, because both men knew there were no good answers anymore, just desperate attempts to maintain control in a world that was slipping through their fingers like water through a sieve. The 13th Amendment had been ratified in December 1865, officially ending slavery throughout the United States. But the reality on the ground in places like rural Georgia was far more complicated. The amendment contained an exception for punishment of crime, and Southern states were already exploiting that loophole through black codes that criminalized unemployment, vagrancy, and a host of other conditions designed to ensnare freed people and return them to conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. Convict leasing was becoming a massive industry, allowing states to rent out prisoners to private companies for labor, creating financial incentives for mass incarceration of black men and women. Rutherford had stared into his own glass for a long moment, watching his reflection distort in the curved surface, seeing a man he no longer quite recognized. The face looking back at him was older than he felt, lined with worries and losses that had accumulated like sediment over the years. Then he nodded once sharply, the gesture of a man making a decision he knows is wrong, but lacks the courage to resist. "Take care of it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "But do it quietly. Last thing I need is those bureau people asking questions, poking around, making trouble. We've got enough problems without attracting that kind of attention." He drained his glass and poured another, trying to wash away the taste of complicity that was already coating his tongue like ash. The Freedmen's Bureau had been established by Congress in March 1865 to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, to provide education and legal assistance and protection from the kind of violence and exploitation that was already becoming commonplace across the South. Officially called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, it was intended to help 4 million newly freed people navigate a world that had never been designed to accommodate their freedom. The Bureau established schools, negotiated labor contracts, settled disputes, and occasionally prosecuted cases of violence against freed people. But it was desperately understaffed and underfunded, with only 900 agents trying to serve the entire South. In rural Georgia, Bureau agents were few and far between, often covering territories of hundreds of square miles from offices in distant towns. Local white power structures actively worked to undermine the Bureau's effectiveness, threatening agents, intimidating freed people who sought help, and making it clear that anyone who cooperated with Bureau investigators would face consequences. The local sheriff was often related by blood or marriage to the plantation owners. Judges and juries saw their primary duty as maintaining white supremacy rather than enforcing the law, and witnesses had a way of disappearing or changing their stories when threatened. But the Bureau existed, a fragile presence that could occasionally shine uncomfortable light on the darkest corners of Southern life, and its existence meant that certain things had to be done out of sight, in places where witnesses were unlikely and evidence could be easily disposed of. So on a humid morning in late April, when the air was thick enough to chew and the sky held that particular quality of light that promises storms later in the day, Samuel was told he was being taken to help clear trees from a new field Rutherford was planning to open for planting. He knew immediately it was a lie. A man who has lived his entire life reading the subtle signs of danger the way others read newspapers develops instincts that operate below the level of conscious thought. Samuel could read the air the way some people read books. Could sense violence approaching the way animals sense storms. The tension in Garrett's shoulders held too rigid, betraying nervousness beneath the bravado. The way the two other men accompanying them, poor whites who hired themselves out for jobs nobody else wanted to do, kept their hands near their guns, fingers twitching with barely contained anticipation. The fact that they were heading deeper into the pine forest that bordered Rutherford's property, away from any actual fields, away from the areas where work crews might be operating, away from eyes and ears and the possibility of witnesses. Samuel had seen men taken away like this before, during the war years when the threat of Union sympathizers and slave rebellions made plantation owners paranoid and trigger-happy. Those men never came back, and the official story was always that they had run away, though everyone knew better. Still, he went because the alternative was to die right there in front of the slave quarters with everyone watching. And at least walking gave him time to think, time to pray, time to prepare his mind for whatever was coming. The forest grew denser as they walked, the cultivated areas giving way to wilderness that had stood relatively untouched for generations. The morning sun filtered through pine branches in dusty shafts of light that cut through the shadows like golden knives. Mosquitoes hummed in clouds near a stagnant creek that smelled of decay and mud, the water dark with tannins leached from decaying vegetation. They walked for nearly an hour, long past the point where the land could reasonably be cleared for planting, long past any pretense that this was about agricultural labor. Samuel's legs were strong from years of work, but the other men were breathing hard, sweating through their shirts, slapping at insects that swarmed around their faces. Garrett led them with the determination of a man who has committed to a course of action and refuses to reconsider, even as doubts begin to creep in. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on some point ahead, and he didn't look back to see if Samuel was following, because he knew the two armed men bringing up the rear ensured compliance. They walked until they reached a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree that rose from the earth like a monument to time itself. Its trunk was easily 12 feet around, gnarled and twisted with age, bark thick and deeply furrowed like the skin of some ancient creature. Its branches spread like the fingers of a giant hand, reaching toward heaven, each limb thick as a normal tree, creating a canopy that cast the clearing in perpetual shade even at midday. The tree had probably been standing for 200 years, perhaps longer, a silent witness to the slow march of history. It had been there long before white men came to Georgia with their claims and deeds and weapons. Back when the Muskogee Creek people had inhabited these lands and the forests had stretched unbroken from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It had stood through the forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838 when 16,000 people were marched westward on the Trail of Tears and 4,000 died along the way. It had stood through the introduction of slavery to Georgia in 1751 when the prohibition against slavery that had been part of the colony's founding was lifted and the plantations began to spread across the landscape like a cancer. It had witnessed the passage of centuries, the rise and fall of empires, the endless human capacity for cruelty dressed up in whatever justifications the era provided.